Alright, before we get into this video, I'm going to do just a small preamble. I like to say before I start videos on biblical slavery. This is probably going to be very basic, very generic, very repeated slavery apologetics. I'm not expecting anything new or anything groundbreaking or anything that's going to change my mind that the Bible 100% allowed for slavery. It didn't say it was bad, it didn't say it was immoral, it didn't say it was wrong in any way, shape, or form. It did have some rules and regulations that protected certain groups of people, but by and large, slavery was absolutely allowed because slavery at the time was kind of the norm. But let's get into this video. Brae17. Let's see what he has to say.
Manage and deal with your slaves. But what we have to realize is long before the Mosaic Law was revealed, slavery was a common practice. It was everywhere and everyone participated in it.
Arguably. Was it a common practice? Yes, absolutely. Everyone, everywhere? I don't think so. I think throughout history, there are some cultures that had no history of slavery. And even within the cultures, I'm sure there are some people that didn't participate within a given culture.
This means that the Mosaic Law didn't create slavery, nor did it end it, which is the main point of contention we're going to tackle today. The Mosaic Law gave rules and regulations on slavery and how it should be done.
We're starting off strong. What do you mean how slavery should be done? Can you like, I mean, take another thing that's absolutely immoral. Let's just say like cold-blooded murder. What do you mean how murder should be done? There's only one way that slavery should be done, and that is don't do it. Full stop. There's no more to it. Just don't do the slavery. Don't do the murder. That's a weird way to phrase that. How slavery should be done. It shouldn't be done. God should have known better.
Rather than outlawing it. But why? Why didn't God just outlaw it?
That's a good question. Why didn't God just outlaw it?
Well, first, what we have to look at is the fact that the Mosaic Law was to prepare the people for the New Testament. And Jesus himself...
Are we talking about, I mean, you can't just say the Mosaic Law was to prepare people for the New Testament. We're not talking about the Mosaic Law. There's a lot of Mosaic laws. We're talking about slavery here. So is he talking about the laws, rules, regulations on slavery were meant to prepare people for the New Testament? I'm curious how he'll tie that together.
Said that Moses allowed things due to the hardness of people's hearts. In Matthew 19:8, Jesus says to the Pharisees that Moses allowed divorce at the time due to the hardness of the Israelites' heart. It's like when a government creates certain drug laws to curb certain issues in society. The bad thing to do is just to outright criminalize drugs when drugs have become commonplace.
So I agree with him. I don't think drugs should be criminalized. But we're not talking about drugs. We're talking about owning other human beings as property. Category error here a little bit.
Instead, the better option is to wean the population off of that practice by creating safe and ethical ways to participate in these dangerous and immoral acts, instead of having them doing it without the guidelines of a higher power. That is just like what God did with slavery. He didn't just outlaw it since the people at that time would still engage in it. Instead, he set guidelines to it.
Okay, terrible argument, because if you're going to make that argument for this, why would you not make that exact same argument for the things that God did outlaw? Were people not engaging in murder? Excuse me, were people not engaging in worshiping false idols? Were people not lying to each other? Were people not coveting their neighbor's ass or whatever? Were people not doing all these things? Yet those were outlawed. All these immoral acts were outlawed, but slavery still wasn't. So no, bad argument here too. People were doing all of the other things that God did outlaw, but yet he didn't want to wean people off of murder, or he didn't want to wean people off of worshiping false idols. He didn't want to wean people off of lying. He didn't want to wean people off of, I mean, there's like 600 of these crazy laws. He didn't want to wean people off of any of these. Did he wean people off of eating shellfish? Did he? You know what I mean? Terrible argument, but he just couldn't get to slavery. Come on.
The Mosaic Law is not an end-all law for moral examples we should follow today. Of course, we could still gain wisdom from it, but it was revealed to the Israelites, a group of people who were too wicked to outright ban slavery. And it was used to try to get those people one step closer to walking more righteous.
But the Mosaic Law was used to ban so many things. Why would God leave slavery out of it? And you also have to remember that the Israelites at this time during Exodus, I mean, the slave laws are in Exodus. Exodus happens when they left Egypt, escaped Egypt, however you want to say it. So they didn't have, unless there was a slave system, unless the Israelites had slaves in Egypt, like they were slaves, but they also had fellow Israelites as slaves, unless that happened, they would have left Egypt with no system of slavery. This would have been a perfect time to say, hey, you know how, and in fact, God does say this. He does mention that you were slaves in Egypt, so we're not gonna do that here, but then they do that there. It would have been a great time for God to say, we're not going to do anything like what they had there. Everybody has freedom, everybody has rights. Don't eat the shellfish. We'll keep that one in. But you know what I mean? This is a perfect time. They had no slave system. God gave them the rules on how to start one.
So in short, the regulation of something is not the promotion of it. And again, we know this from God's strong
It's not the regulation of slavery that's the problem. I mean, of course, there are many problematic rules in there are many problematic regulations in the Bible regarding slavery, but it's the fact that it was allowed, not the regulation.
Disdain for divorce.
Did God like slavery? God loved slavery. I don't care what anybody says. He loved slavery. He wasn't super keen on Israelites owning other Israelites, but man, he liked him some slavery.
As seen in Malachi.
I mean, he liked slavery so much that he would have humans, virgins, brought to him as spoils of war. God would say, hey, out of, I don't remember the exact numbers, but every 100 pieces of silver you get, I get one of those. Every 100 cattle you get, I get 2 of those, whatever the numbers are. Every, whatever human you capture, every war captive, which were slaves, let's just be honest, I get a certain portion of those. God himself wanted him some slaves.
Malachi 2:15. Yet we still see the regulation of it throughout the Old and New Testament. Now I think we must define and differentiate the transatlantic slave trade to ancient Near Eastern.
Why? Was it a different kind of slavery? Sure. Was it similar in many ways? Yes. Was it different in ways? Sure. Who cares? Who cares? Why? This is a good example of Christians creating a dilemma, and then offering a counter argument to that dilemma. But the only people I've ever heard bring up the transatlantic slave trade when talking about biblical slavery are Christians. I've never brought this up. I've never heard anybody bring this up except Christians. I don't care if it was similar. I don't care if it was different. It's slavery. Did they own other humans as property? Then all right, it's slavery. I don't care what the differences are, what the similarities are. All right, let's keep going.
Slavery. The transatlantic slave trade was based on race. It was built on the idea that some people were less human than others, and therefore you could kidnap them, force them into slavery, and treat them as you please.
Just like biblical slavery. Not the Exodus biblical slavery, but just like biblical slavery.
The biggest thing to remember is that this kind of slavery is based on race, and is...
That's not the biggest thing to remember. There's no benefit to remember that transatlantic slave trade was based on race. There's no benefit to that. There's no reason to do that. It doesn't matter what slavery is based on. It makes no difference. It's slavery. I don't care if it was based on race. I don't care. Why does this matter?
Is driven by kidnapping. During the transatlantic slave trade, things like beating, forced procreation, and R-wording were all commonplace. And this is what people tend to think about when they hear the word slavery.
But it's not. It is not. The only people who tend to think about this, I don't even think Christians tend to think about this. I think it's more that they want you to think of it this way so they can make some differences, so they can point out the differences in it. But it doesn't matter. Slavery is slavery. This is not what I when I hear the word slavery, I think owning another human being as property. That's it, full stop. The rules and regulations that come after that are something different. Slavery is owning another human being as property. Let's keep going.
But this is not what went on in Israel. And this is not how God regulated it for the Israelites.
Okay. Accurate. This isn't how God regulated it for the Israelites. Sure.
You know, many aspects of African slavery and Israelite slavery were vastly different. Since with Israelite slavery, they were not allowed to beat, kill, rape, or kidnap their slaves.
Well, I mean, yes, they were-ish.
Since with Israelite slavery, they were not allowed.
They were not allowed to beat. Yes, they were. It's explicitly written in Exodus, I think 2021, whatever, that they were allowed to beat their slaves. I don't know where he's getting that from. Could they kidnap their fellow Israelite slaves? No, that's accurate. Or R-word, their slaves. I don't know where it's explicitly forbidden. I can definitely tell you some places where it's 100% implied. Because if a father sells his daughter into slavery, and she doesn't please the master, can he force himself on her? Well, I don't know. But how consensual could it possibly be? You know what I mean? Maybe it was like a reluctant, it wasn't a full, willing, enthusiastic participation in the act, which I could definitely would be a form of R-wording. But how enthusiastic could she be? Like, one day she's just sold off as property, and she's expected to perform wifely duties. And if she doesn't perform those wifely duties, then he can just give her to his son as a wife. And so literally she could just get passed down the line of the family. And then the father would have to then treat his former wife as a daughter. It's really weird, but I don't know. I wouldn't say it's explicitly forbidden.
Allowed to beat, kill, rape, or kidnap their slaves. And we're going to look at scripture to see what the Bible actually says about slavery. Okay. You know, instead of just out of context verses, which a lot of critics love to do. Just to make God seem immoral. Rape was not allowed under any circumstances back in ancient Israel, and it was punishable by death. This would lead.
Yes and no. There was definitely some verses. Is he going to bring the verses in? Because, I mean, if you were, oh man, I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what it was, but I do believe if you were a non-virgin, or maybe if you were a virgin who wasn't betrothed, and you got R-worded, there was just a fine. It wasn't death.
To any kinds of unwanted sexual relations with your slave would be against the regulations. We also know that sex outside of marriage was not allowed. Again, making the R-wording of your slaves against the regulations of God.
Whoa, careful, buddy. Maybe I misheard you, but did you just say that if you're married that it's not R-wording? Maybe I misheard him on that, but yeah, I mean you can definitely R-word your spouse.
Sex outside of marriage was not allowed. Again, making the R-wording of your slaves against the regulations of God.
What if you were married to your slave, like when a father sells his daughter?
We know that rape was just one of the many heinous atrocities that took place during the transatlantic slave trade, but the slavery regulated by the Mosaic Law had laws against those acts. This goes to show that the Mosaic Law was a law made to prepare people whose hearts were hardened, and was still a major advancement for human rights. In Exodus 21, verse 16, it says that anyone who is found kidnapping or in possession of someone who has been kidnapped, they shall be put to death. This law...
Again, this is just very basic, very generic, run-of-the-mill apologetics for slavery. There's nothing new here this so far. Maybe he's going to blow my mind here in a little bit, but this is very basic. So we'll start with, okay, kidnapping is strictly against the rules. Kidnapping your fellow Israelites is definitely against the rules, but in many other circumstances, it's absolutely not against the rules. In fact, in some circumstances, it's commanded, unless you consider. I mean, if you go into a city and you attack, you lay siege on the city and you win, and you have all these civilians, these people who had nothing to do with the military aspect of that city, and you can take them and you can force slave, put them into force to basically make them slaves. I don't think it explicitly says slaves, but it definitely says that you can take them and use them as forced labor. If these are spoils of war, you can call it spoils of war if you want to, but that's kidnapping. I mean, these people, you're taking somebody against their will. I mean, you've just kidnapped them. Whether it was after a battle or after whatever. I mean, you're kidnapping them, and this is what was commanded to be done with the survivors of a war. Anyone who kidnapped or had kidnapped victims, you were to put to death. Again, if you kidnap your fellow Israelites, sure. The rules of Exodus, I mean, it clearly states these are the rules you were. Exodus 20, I believe, starts with, these are the rules you are to set before them, and the them in that sentence is your Hebrews, and those rules, the kidnapping rule is in Hebrews or Exodus 20. So yeah, you can't. They didn't want you kidnapping your fellow Israelites, sure, but I mean, I don't think that rule really applied to outside of Israel.
Alone condemns the transatlantic slave trade, as its whole foundation was built on kidnapping Africans. And
okay, so were the Africans kidnapped? Yes and no. So, there's war captives, there's all these things, which, yeah, I would consider a form of kidnapping, but it's not like necessarily. Of course, this did happen, but I mean, there were slave traders in Africa, and the Americans would just buy kidnapped slaves or spoils of war slaves, whatever. But that kind of slavery is absolutely allowed, explicitly allowed in the Bible. You can go to the nations that surround you. From them, you may buy your slaves. Where do you think they were buying the slaves from? They were going to slave traders, and they were purchasing kidnapped human beings. You know what I mean? Like there are many similarities and there are many differences between biblical slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. I don't really care what the similarities and differences were. The point is, they were both slavery. They were both owning other human beings as property. And in both circumstances, you could just go to another nation and you could just buy more slaves.
And then selling them across the Atlantic.
This would not make the selling of slaves illegal. This would make the kidnapping, buying, and selling of Israelite slaves illegal. But you could, okay.
There'd be no way for someone to buy or sell any kidnapped people under God's regulations of slavery.
Any Hebrew kidnapped people. Be specific. Get it right. I'm so tired of having to go over this. He's had to have heard this before. All of these apologists have had to have heard this before. That these rules apply to Hebrew, your fellow Israelites, not to the heathens that surround you. Why All right. This what I'll make. Whoa. Okay, hold on. This would also make the owning of slaves illegal? Is he trying to say that owning slaves was illegal? Did he already go over this?
As it is outright banned and punishable by death. Now if we look at Exodus 21,
Hold
was
on.
built on kidnapping Africans and then selling them across the Atlantic. There'd be no way for someone to buy or sell any kidnapped people under God's regulations of slavery, as it is outright banned and punishable by death. Now if we look at Exodus 21.
So why is he not, he has points up here. Why is he not going over them? Why is he not going over his own he just missed part 4. How, explain part 4. This would also make owning slaves illegal? Is he trying to say, I mean, that it's so demonstrably wrong that I would be embarrassed to put number 4 up here. How could he say that this would make the owning of slaves illegal? They definitely owned slaves. He opened up his own video with saying of how God would regulate slavery, how slavery should be done, as he put it. How on earth? But he doesn't explain it. Maybe he means something different with his rule 4 here. But let's keep going.
And then selling them across the Atlantic. There'd be no way for someone to buy or sell any kidnapped people under God's regulations of slavery.
Hebrew
as
people.
It is outright
again.
Banned and punishable by death. Now if we look at Exodus 21, verse 26 and 27, it says that if you strike your slave and their eye is damaged or they lose a tooth.
So I'm curious what he's going to say about this, because as we saw in the beginning part of this video that you were not allowed to. Oh, okay. This is. I wonder if he's going to talk about the verse where it says you can strike them as long as they don't die within a couple days, because this is like permanent. And again, the most important thing to remember here is that this is a rule to protect your fellow Israelite slaves, but this is a rule that protects your fellow Israelite slaves and causing grievous permanent bodily injury. I mean, you can still hit them.
You shall set them free. Now, when God says this, it's clear he isn't just concerned about teeth or a black eye, but rather just overall bodily harm.
Not just overall bodily harm. You don't get to say that. You don't get to say overall bodily harm. You're telling me that under the rules of Exodus, you can't go and just, let's just say, you can't just go and just give your slaves a little pop. Nothing. You just cannot cause any bodily harm. Come on. Come on, man. This is talking about permanent. Is God in this verse just talking about an eye or a tooth? I would say no. I think what he's trying to say is permanent physical, altering your body in some way. I would say that when it says an eye for an eye or tooth for tooth, whatever, or that's not this verse, but if it says if you knock out a tooth or if you put out an eye, if you cause some type of permanent injury. So I would say that this would also extend to you can't cut your slaves' hands off, or you can't cut their feet off, or you can't break their bones, or cause some type of other permanent bodily harm. But you could absolutely beat them. You can do some pretty wicked things to a person without causing permanent injury. I mean, just use your imagination.
The next verse that we're looking at is one that I've been getting a lot in my comments. Exodus 21, verse 20 to 21. It says,
okay, yeah,
says that if you beat your slave and they die under your hand,
well, okay, so he's again, I'm pausing it a little bit early here, but he's already reading this verse wrong, because he left out if anyone beats their male or female slaves with a rod, he left that out. So there's an instrument that you can hit your slaves with, and then it says if they die as a result, but that's not exactly what it says. It says they die as a result within a day or two. You know what I mean? Let's keep
you
going.
shall be punished. But if he lives a day or two, you shall not be punished. People like to take this verse out of context and say that you can beat your slave within an inch of their life.
No. People can do that. People can take it out of context and say that you can beat them within an inch of their life, but I don't read the verse this way. I don't read the verse this way at all. I read it as that you can beat them. I don't care whether it's within an inch of their life or it's just taking the rod and just giving them one good whack on the back. All of it is awful. Don't do any of it. This is terrible. The only way you can make this verse sound good is if you give a little bit of a preamble saying that you can beat them within an inch of their life. But what if, leave that part out. It's okay. So it's not beating within an inch of their life. But what if it's taking a whip and giving them 10 lashes on the back? That's immoral. That's disgusting. That's awful. But I see no reason within the biblical rules of slavery, even for their fellow Israelites, that you wouldn't 100% be able to do this.
And if they're fine, you can't be punished. But if we look at the Hebrew word that was translated into punish, it is the Hebrew word for avenge, which in many cases is used more for a life kind of punishment. Meaning that it's not saying that you shall see no consequences for beating your slave. Rather, you just won't be put to death for it, as you didn't kill them. And again, as we went over earlier in the same chapter, it says if you beat your slave, and they lose a tooth or have damage to their eye, they shall be set free. Now do you guys see how the skeptics just took that right out of context? They build a whole false idea about what the Bible teaches just...
No, absolutely not.
Rather, you just won't be put to death for it, as a slave within an inch of their life. And if they're fine, you can't be punished. But if we look at the Hebrew word that was translated into punish, it is the Hebrew word for avenge, which in many cases is used more for a life You shall not be punished.
Okay, so is he trying to... Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished. What is he talking about here?
People like to take this verse out of context and say that you can beat your slave within an inch of their life. And if they're fine, you can't be punished. But if we look at the Hebrew word that was translated into punish, it is the Hebrew word for avenge, which in many cases is used...
Okay, so the word for avenge, the word punish translates into avenge, used more so to refer to the death. Okay, so let's just say, let's take the word punish out and replace it for the word revenge. Anyone who beats their male or female slaves with a rod must be avenged. But if the slave does not die as a direct result, they are not to be avenged. Okay, what's the point here? I don't understand.
People like to take this verse out of context and say that you can...
So if you anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be avenged if the slave dies as a direct result. But if they are not to be avenged if the slave recovers. What's his point?
Beat your slave within an inch of their life. And if they're fine, you can't be punished. But if we look at the Hebrew word that was translated into punish, it is the Hebrew word for avenge, which in many cases is used more for a life kind of punishment. Meaning that it's not saying that you shall see no consequences for beating your slave. Rather,
this just means... Okay, this means this isn't saying the abusive master won't see consequences. Rather, he just won't be put to death. But no, it's not. No, it's not in any way. You could even go back and plug in if a master beats their slave with a rod, and they will be put to death if he dies within a couple of days. If he doesn't die within a couple of days, he will not be put to death. What's the point here? If the slave doesn't die within a couple days as a direct result of your beating him or her, you are not to be punished. It's clear, it's written, it says it. What are you getting at, Brae17?
You just won't be put to death for it, as you didn't kill them. And again, as we went over earlier in the same chapter, it says if you beat your slave.
So yes, all this has done is pretty much confirm that if you cause a permanent bodily injury, your slave is, again, you're also not to be, you're not going to be put to death for that because you didn't kill him, sure, but you're also not going to be punished. You lose your slave, basically. They're to be set free if you cause them permanent bodily injury. Now, if you just beat them and don't kill them and don't cause permanent bodily injury, there's no punishment. This is allowed. This is acceptable. This is fine. I don't understand what is the overall point that he's trying to get at here. Does the Bible say that you can own another human being as property? Yes. Does it say it's wrong, immoral, unjust, or in any way try to discourage slavery? No. Does the Bible say that you can beat your slave? That you can inflict any amount of physical harm on them? Yes. What's the point?
And they lose a tooth or have damage to their eye, they shall be set free. Now do you guys see how the skeptics just took that right out of context?
No.
They build a whole false idea about what the Bible teaches.
Okay, what does it say? Controversial. Many skeptics love to take verses out of context in the Old Testament to make God's laws seem immoral, to make the argument that God is fiction. Okay. There's a already nobody says that. I would argue, I've definitely never heard the argument that, well, God's laws seem immoral, therefore he cannot exist, or that he's fiction. I've never heard this argument, but God's laws don't seem immoral. They are immoral. And you did nothing to change that view, that you can own another human being as property and you can strike them. I don't care if it's just a little tap. Don't do that either. You have no right to touch somebody else without their consent in any way, shape, or form. But you get the point. We're not talking about taps. We're talking about hitting somebody with a rod. You're taking a stick of some sort and you are making contact. What? Okay, let's keep going.
Just because of little snippets. When if they actually just read the whole chapter,
yeah, I did read the whole chapter.
Preferably, they would see that no, you can't just beat your slave within an inch of their life and see.
Okay, it's so irrelevant that I'll just agree. No, you cannot beat your slave within an inch of their life. Who cares? Who cares? Wait, that's so irrelevant. What? Okay.
No consequences. They'd be set free if you did that. You just wouldn't be killed. Next, let's look in Deuteronomy, where it says that if you find a runaway slave, you are to help them, give them shelter, and not oppress them. This is completely opposite to what happened during the transatlantic slave trade, where they would root.
I don't care. This is so irrelevant. Another absolutely irrelevant point. I don't care. I don't care if biblical slavery was the most amazing kind of slavery you could think of. If it was so just not even comparable to the transatlantic slave trade, I don't care. I have one question. Was the person free to go? If the answer is no, it was pretty disgusting and it was immoral. I've made this comparison in my videos before. If you have a married couple, and let's just say that the man is very wealthy, he makes tons of money, but his spouse is like a stay-at-home spouse, and all of the spouse's needs are met. Food, entertainment, TV, warmth, clothing, everything. It was just given to them. But the spouse wasn't free to leave the house. Now, the man in this relationship never lays a hand on them, never beats them, never R-words them, nothing. Everything is consensual. But she's not allowed to make phone calls, or she's not allowed to leave. They can never leave the house. That's immoral. That's wrong. Now, is that better than the transatlantic slave trade? Sure. Is it better than biblical slavery? Sure. But it's still slavery. It's still wrong. Why are we comparing? If the only argument here is that biblical slavery isn't the absolute most barbaric, worst type of slavery that one could conjure up in their imaginations, then yeah, I'll give it to you, sure. But it's still slavery. Let's keep going.
Routinely go on slave hunts for runaway slaves. They would either kill them or bring them back to their masters. What God regulated for the Israelites is to allow for mistreated slaves, slaves of masters who were brave.
And again, now we're talking about let's keep going.
Taking the regulations we went over earlier to actually escape and then be protected by the community. Next, we can.
You know what? This is such a non-argument. I don't care. I'm just going to say, yes, I agree. If a slave runs away and they come to the land of Israel, they're to be given 37 pints of beer and a free house and food for life. And it was the most amazing and glorious thing that a runaway slave could ever come into. I don't care. It's
You can look at Leviticus 25, where it talks about how Israelite slaves can go back to their land promised to them by God, while non-Israelite slaves would have to stay with their masters and could be passed down as inheritance. Atheists and other non-believers love to take this verse out of context and say,
everything's out of context.
Say that you can own people and do what you will with them, but nowhere in.
So this is what what I've noticed in this video from Brae17 is what he likes to do is take the correct argument and then add something in very sneakily. So he'll say, it's almost like the Bible says that you can't own slaves, or that you can own slaves, that you can beat slaves, and you can take their toes and you can cut them off, and you can do all these extra stuff. And then he'll ignore the fact that you can own slaves, and then he'll focus on the extra stuff that he added in, like he just did right here.
As inheritance. Atheists and other non-believers love to take this verse out of context and say that you can own people and do what you will with them. Let's leave that part out. That part is irrelevant. Can you own people? The answer is yes. Anything else that comes after that can be better or can be worse than something else. But it's irrelevant. You're still owning another human being as property, whether you can do what you will with them or not. But nowhere in that verse does it speak about that. We have to remember it firstly speaks about Israel.
I mean, it does, because the verse just before this, maybe 43 or 42, whatever, it says that you can't rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. And then it goes on to say your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them, you may buy slaves, which is a complete contradiction to his earlier statements about the whole you can't buy slaves, you can't own slaves, you can't sell slaves. I mean, it says right here you may buy slaves. If you can't, if there's no slave trade, if there's no buying and selling, then who are you buying slaves from? But we'll keep going. 45. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living in among you, sojourning, whatever, and members of the clans born in your country. They will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property, and you can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. So it's reiterated twice. He left the verses that came before this out a little bit, but it's so it doesn't say that you can treat your non-Israelite slaves ruthlessly, but it's 100% implied when it clearly states twice within this verse, a little bit before this verse, and then at the end of this verse, it says you can't rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly, and then again it says, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. It never once says anything about ruling over non-Israelites ruthlessly, and since it's so explicitly stated that you can't do this to your Israelites, it's kind of explicitly stated that you can do it to other people. if that makes any sense. Let's keep going.
Israelite slaves being freed on the year of Jubilee.
And why does he just have this lady being beat in the background this entire time? Jesus Christ, dude.
Which is a time that comes every 50 years, where all the debts and slave contracts of the Israelites are given up. But this leads to an issue for the non-Israelites, or the Gentile
you have
slaves.
So you have, I think, like every 6 or 7 years that the Israelite slaves can go free, but there are rules and regulations and little tricks that you can do to even keep those slaves forever. But okay, let's just give it to them the year of Jubilee, every 40 years, every 50 years, whatever it is, that all slaves go free. And even if you want to argue that this does apply to non-Israelite slaves, fine, I'll give it to you. But if you're coming in as a slave, let's just say at the ripe old age of 20, and you're a slave and you're going to be free in 50 years, you're going to be 70 if you can possibly live that long in this era. I don't think 70 was the average lifespan in this time period. So effectively, even if you were a slave when you were born, you would be free after that 50 years. Or maybe it's 40. I think it's 50. You'd be free. You'd be 50. What is the average lifespan? Let's just say it is 70. So you have 50 years a slave and 20 years not. That's if you were a slave when you were born. All right, let's keep going.
They do not have any land to go back to, as they are not of Israel. This means that they would have to serve out the rest of their contracts, however long that may be. But as we already went over in the other passages, this wouldn't be a kidnapping situation, as you aren't allowed to kidnap. This wouldn't be speaking about any abusive situation.
Okay, I'm just going to grant all of his arguments here that it's not a kidnapping situation. So what? That you can't beat them. So what? Is the person free to go? Do they have autonomy? Are they free to make their own choices? The answer is absolutely not. No. It's immoral. It's disgusting. Even if I grant all these other arguments, I have one question. Is the person free to go? And stop referring to slavery as a contract. It says you may buy your slaves. You can own them for life, however long the contract may be. Well, it turns out the contract is lifetime. So essentially what you're saying is when they, however long the contract may be, what you're saying is until they die. That's lifetime slavery. Let's keep going. You're getting worse and worse.
As the slave could run away and seek help from the community if the masters were breaking any of the regulations given by God. Now you might say, well, isn't God racist then? He clearly allows better rights to one group of people based on their bloodline.
I don't know. I don't think whether God was racist or not is irrelevant when it comes to this, because stop trying to compare it to race-based slavery. I know at least that it was not race-based slavery. I don't care that it wasn't race-based slavery. This isn't an argument that I've ever heard any non-Christian make. This is an argument that comes from the Christian community that it wasn't race-based. Who cares? Because I fully believe that the Israelites and the Canaanites and the Midianites and all the other Idiotites were all probably the same race. But who cares? So it wasn't race-based. I'm granting this. It wasn't race-based. Was the person free to go? No, it's immoral.
This is a common misconception about Israel.
It's not a common misconception, at least not that I've heard. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is a huge atheist talking point that, man, God was racist because he did the race-based slavery thing, but I have never once heard it, and I've listened to a lot of slavery videos. Never once have I heard an atheist make the argument that it was race-based. This is a fake Christian argument so they can give a counter argument to it. All right.
In ancient Israel, you could be grafted into Israel based on your belief in the one true God of Abraham. Despite what many Talmudic Jews will tell you, ancient Israel had Gentiles grafted into the nation based on their belief in Yah. In the Old
Despite what the Jews will say. All right, are you going to back that up with scripture?
Testament, Israel was a body of believers, and to remain in the body of Israel, you had to be obedient to the covenant.
Still, well, no, you can't talk about Israelites in Genesis. There was no such thing as an Israelite in Genesis. Priest Rahab was Canaanite, and Jesus is actually directly descended from, supposedly, sure. Ruth of the Moabite Confess that the Lord is. I don't care about any of this.
While strangers or Gentiles who also did so would be considered native born and granted all the same privileges. We see all throughout the Old Testament, Gentiles were grafted into the nation and called true believers. We have Melchizedek.
Again, this is an argument that I don't care about, so I'm just going to grant, okay, so they were non-believers, they were grafted in. I mean, I'm sure that there are strong arguments against this, but the fact is, when it comes down to it, is I don't care. I'll grant it. Fine. Yeah, if you were a non-believer of the Lord of Israel, and then you became a Lord of Israel, then you could be a member of the tribe. I don't care. What does this have to do with slavery? And could you own another human being? Yes, it's immoral.
Who was called a high priest in Genesis 14:18. There's also the Canaanite Rahab, who confessed the God of Israel was Lord. She was married into the family of Israel and was in the direct line of Jesus himself. Ruth, the Moabite, married an Israelite, and after his death, she joined herself to Israel and the Lord by declaring, "Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God." And finally, when Moses led his people out of Egypt, there was a mixed multitude that went along with them. This mixed multitude of people could have been any other nationality that had been in Egypt at that time, who feared the true Lord and were grafted into Israel. And after Moses freed...
Well, no, because the slaves, the people coming out of Egypt, would have had really no knowledge of the God at the time. They would have, I mean, this is why God came down to say, hey, I'm God, I'm the only God, there's no other gods, these are some rules, here's some regulation, here's some laws, here's where you need to set up camp, here's what you need to do, here's all this stuff. They didn't have any of this stuff. All of this stuff came from the story of the Exodus, which is when they were leaving Egypt. Let's keep going.
His people, God gave laws to Israel concerning...
But again, yes, the bottom line is I don't care.
...the Passover feast. And when a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord,
I want to just clarify something. Of course, they had knowledge of the God, but not all the laws and the rules and the regulations. When they were in Egypt, yes, they knew about the God because he did the whole Pharaoh thing, but not intimately like they would have once Moses hit the Mount Sinai and got the rules and all that good stuff.
Let all his males be circumcised, and let him come...
Hey, what's up with that, dude? I want to hear some apologetics for circumcision. What the... Why? It's weird. It gets so weird. Bizarre, dude. Bizarre. Okay.
Come near and keep it, and he shall be as a native of the land. Exodus 12:48.
Yeah. Another absolutely immoral act. Circumcision. It's bizarre. It's barbaric. It's
stranger was to be counted as a native of the land, so long as he participated in the worship of the one true God.
Okay, maybe I'm pausing more, but I feel like he's been talking about this nonsense way longer than all of the other slavery stuff. Like, what is this?
So no, God isn't a racist. He isn't a national...
Okay, so we can bring it up. Is Israel an ethnicity? We can wrap it back into is he... okay, let's keep going.
He simply had favoritism towards people that believed in him. But even if they chose to continue on in their unbelief, they were still granted basic human rights and protections.
The Canaanites might disagree. But the Midianites might disagree.
Point people like to bring up about slavery and Christianity is the use of the Bible to justify slavery. The thing no one brings up when they try to use this as a dunk on the morality of God is that man had to corrupt and remove multiple books and verses from the Bible to justify it. This would mean that in no...
Okay, for the love of God. Why do you just have, it's like 10 minutes straight of some dude being beat in the background? Are you trying to create, put an image in saying, oh, look what's going on in the background? That's not what biblical slavery is. It's weird, dude. I don't know why you did that. But setting that aside, here's my problem with the whole, the Bible was used to was used as a justification for the chattel slavery in the US. Here's my problem. And it's that in the beginning of this video, you stated that this was a way to wean people off of slavery. Now, God is omniscient. He knows all. He knows every single thing that's going to happen from beginning to end, exactly when it's going to happen, exactly why it's going to happen. He knows all of this stuff. And so point number one is that you said that this was going to be used to wean people off of slavery. Now, Exodus was written roughly 3,500 years ago, and the Bible was used to justify slavery, roughly 200 years ago, give or take. So this is the longest weaning process I have ever heard of in my life. The fact that 3,500 years later, 37 or roughly 3,500 years later, you could say 3,200 years later, whatever. I'll even go, you know what? I'm going to give it to you. 3,000 years later, we still have slavery, the longest weaning process. That's why I don't buy this argument. If it was a weaning process, it should have ended well before Jesus's time. But even in Jesus's, you get the point. Problem number two is that with God's omniscience, God surely would have known that 3,500 years later, people are going to take his book and use it to justify slavery. And he did nothing to stop that either. He didn't give why didn't God just he wouldn't have affected anybody's free will. He wouldn't have made people believe. You could have still had just faith that God existed. If God put an actual copy of the Bible without the 80% of the Bible removed, he could have put that in the, he could have just kept putting Bibles in the slave houses. He could have done anything that wouldn't directly affect free will, that wouldn't, I'm not saying he should have came down and said, stop the slave. Well, he should have done that, but I'm not saying, he shouldn't have came down and did the whole stop the slavery and then people would have been forced to believe and it would have affected their free will. None of that, but just magic some Bibles up in the slave houses so that they would have access to the full Bible. There's a million things he could have done differently. But the fact is that he wrote a book knowing that in 3,000 years, people were going to take that book, take 80% of it out and use it to still do the slavery. So I don't buy the whole weaning process thing. And I don't, God failed miserably when it came to writing this book. Because, he could have, you get the point.
No way was the transatlantic slave trade a reflection
Stop with the
of
beating
what
on
God wanted us to live
bro.
as. It is
just trying to do a slavery apologetic video, and so real quick, so that was pretty brutal. We're gonna watch this little background video again.
Is that man had to corrupt and remove multiple books and verses from the Bible to justify it.
All right, now watch the person's back as he's whipping.
This would
him.
mean that in no way was the transatlantic slave trade a reflection of what.
Pretty disgusting, pretty brutal. Now, what I want somebody to do is tell me specifically in the Bible what explicitly and specifically outlawed that. Why couldn't a slave master do that to his slave? And maybe not so brutal. I'll just say just once. Why couldn't a slave master do that one time, one whip, one lash across the back? What rule explicitly says you can't do that? I'm curious.
God wanted us to live as. It is pretty evident that the Bible did not create slavery.
Another argument that I don't understand. It's an argument that I've never heard come from a non-believer. I've never once heard it, and maybe I'm wrong. But who's saying that the Bible created slavery? this was repeated. Dan Kimball did it. I did a video of Dan Kimball's slavery apologetics. It was one of my very early videos, and it's in fact the reason I started a YouTube channel, because his slavery apologetics were so bad that they infuriated me enough to create a YouTube channel and start it. But he said both of those points repeatedly, multiple times. Biblical slavery was not race-based. Biblical slavery, the Bible didn't create slavery. Two arguments I've never heard anybody make except Christians, so they can counter it for some reason, because it's 2 points that I'll just grant. It wasn't race-based, fine, I don't care. The Bible didn't create it. Of course they didn't create it, but who cares? Let's keep going.
Rather, we, the wicked humans, did as a consequence of our sin. Our wicked nature.
And again, this is another thing I said a lot during Dan Kimball's book, is that it was created because of the wickedness of your sin. So what that means is, and at least how I take it, is that just remember that slavery is your fault.
Led us to exploit and take advantage of people and enslave them, while it was God who took the first steps to get rid of it. I don't even have to...
God took 0 steps to get rid of it. Not one single step did God take to get rid of slavery. Not one. And if you want to make the argument he did, he failed miserably. He absolutely failed. I'm not in the best shape of my life. I could do a lot better. But I'm going to say that I'm going to go climb Mount Everest, and then I'm going to take a step, and that would be the equivalent. And I'm going to go sit down and be like, I took the first steps to climbing Mount Everest. That's the equivalent to what God did to end in slavery. If you want to say he took the first steps to ending it, he did a very terrible job, and he failed miserably, because it's still here. But all right, let's keep going. What does it say? People like to say that since the Bible was used to justify the owning of slaves, that must mean the Bible and Christianity is pro-slavery. The Bible is pro-slavery. I mean, you can make Christianity kind of whatever you want, I guess.
I have to bring up how most of the abolitionists used the uncorrupted Bible to denounce and condemn slavery. But that just further cements the fact about Christianity being anti-slavery. But before you go,
I don't. So is Christianity okay? Is modern day Christianity anti-slavery? By and large, yeah, sure, but I don't care. I mean, that's a good thing. Good job finally getting up, get with the program. But slavery was still, it was rampant with the Jews and their culture, and that in the ancient time, and it was rampant in Christianity up until pretty recently, because of the video that they keep playing in the background here. I guarantee you that the person who was holding that whip, of course, I know it's a movie, but that the person that he is supposed to represent was a Christian. The point is that you can use the Bible to justify slavery. You can. You absolutely can. And you can arguably use the New Testament to somehow sort of say that slavery was a bad thing. Not really, but let's just grant it. The point is that you can use it to say it's good, you can use it to say it's bad, and anything that can do both also does nothing. So you have to use something else. Secular humanism. But let's keep going.
I thought I'd leave you with a verse. Just as a body, though one, has many parts, and all its parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we are all baptized by one Spirit, so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink.
Okay, well that ended very abruptly, but
a lot of people claim that.
So I fully believe that in Jesus's eyes, I'm going to end on this note. I fully believe that in Jesus's eyes, he thought that if you were a slave, and this is referencing the verse that he just read, if you were a slave, it didn't matter. You were still going to get into heaven as long as you did the believey thing. And that's all that verse means. It doesn't matter if you're a sinner, if you're a saint, if you're a slave, if you're wealthy, if you're whatever the case may be. If you have a pathway to God. And that's it. No more, no less. If you're trying to say that slaves, that verse meant that they should have been treated equal or had rights on earth, you're wrong. It's clearly not what that means. It's just to say that you're going to still go to heaven even if you're a slave. But just remember, obey your masters, especially the cruel ones. All right, we're wrapping it up.